A starving K-9 came out of a Washington blizzard and scratched at a Navy SEAL's door. Around her neck was a battered tag with a name, a code, and a forgotten weather cabin. Reed Kincaid thought silence was the safest place left for a man like him. But Tally was not asking to be saved. She was leading him back into the snow, toward a woman trapped with records someone wanted erased. Because high above the valley, an old cabin still remembered the storms people had survived by listening. Stay with this story and tell us where you're watching from. Please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. Winter had taught Reed Kincaid the mercy of numbers. 16 pieces of split cedar by the stove, 3 cans of soup left on the second shelf, 2 batteries charged for the handheld radio, 1 rode out if the snowplow remembered the lower bend before noon. 0 reasons to drive into town unless something was broken and someone else had run out of pride. At 53, Reed had made a quiet kingdom out of what could be counted. His cabin sat at the edge of the Olympic foothills in Washington, where the trees stood tall and dark as old judges, and the winter light came down so clean it seemed almost cruel. Snow softened the roof, the porch rail, the stack of firewood, the hood of his old truck. Beyond the clearing, firs and hemlocks climbed into the pale morning like a congregation that had forgotten its hymn. Inside, everything had its place. The boots by the door, the axe beside the wood rack, the radio on the table, antenna angled toward the ridge. A coil of paracord hung from a nail near the stove. A chipped enamel mug sat upside down on a towel. Reed liked objects that stayed where he put them. People had a way of moving, needing, asking, remembering. Objects were kinder. He stood at the kitchen counter before dawn, wearing his olive-drab combat shirt, the fitted torso faded from use, the camouflage sleeves worn soft at the elbows. The dark horizontal bands around the upper arms still held their shape, though the cloth had lost its old sharpness. Over the shirt, he wore a slate-gray canvas jacket with a torn cuff he had never bothered to mend. His hair, dark brown with silver running clean through both temples, had been flattened by sleep and lifted again by cold air sneaking under the door. He shaved when he had to. That morning he had not had to. Gray stubble shadowed his jaw, uneven but short. His face had once been called handsome by a woman who had left him before the war taught him how many ways silence could bruise a room. Now it was leaner, lined, carved by weather and watchfulness. His eyes were a winter gray blue, the kind of eyes that did not look away quickly, but also did not invite anyone closer. The kettle began to tremble on the stove. Reed turned off the flame before it screamed. He did not like sharp sounds before sunrise. The old handheld radio gave a burst of static from the table, then settled into its low electrical whisper. Reed glanced at it, waited, heard nothing useful, and poured hot water over coffee grounds. The smell rose dark and bitter. Outside, wind dragged snow across the porch in long white ribbons. He had once lived by voices in his ear. Coordinates, commands, breathless confirmations. Men speaking softly because fear could hear. Later, after the Navy, he had tried to serve in a different way, joining a volunteer rescue network along the Olympic coast. Flood calls, landslide checks, missing hikers, ferry trouble in ugly weather, civilian emergencies with civilian faces. That had been worse in some ways. In war, danger wore a uniform if a man was lucky. In the mountains, danger wore rain, fog, dead batteries, bad roads, and people who thought they had another hour before the water rose. Reed had left that network after one winter no one in town spoke of directly anymore. He had not explained. He had simply stopped answering check-ins, stopped attending safety meetings, stopped letting anyone depend on him. By spring, people had learned to call someone else. That was how he preferred it. Now he repaired generators, truck heaters, snowmobile engines, and radios for the people scattered between the foothills and the coast. He charged too little. He spoke less than that. He fixed what he could and closed the door before anyone could offer coffee with a chair pulled out beside it. The world still came to him broken. He just no longer followed it home. By mid-morning, the storm had brightened instead of darkened. It was one of those Washington winter storms that did not turn the sky black, but white. White road, white air, white ridge, white breath. The forest beyond the clearing vanished and returned in pieces, as if some god were lifting and lowering a veil. Reed was in the shed behind the cabin, replacing the cracked fuel line on a neighbor's generator, when he heard the first scrape. Not a knock, not a branch. A scrape. He straightened slowly, wrench in hand. The wind dragged loose snow across the shed door. He listened. There it came again. A hard, frantic clawing from the front of the cabin. Reed set the wrench down, wiped his hands on a rag, and stepped into the storm. Snow struck his face in bright grains. His bad knee complained when he crossed the yard, but he moved with old control, weight placed carefully, shoulders steady. At the porch, something dark and gold threw itself against the lower half of the front door. A German shepherd, female from the build. Too thin, too desperate. Her coat should have been black and gold, but snow had crusted over it until she looked like she had crawled out from beneath a collapsed winter. Honey-colored fur showed through along her legs and chest. A black saddle ran along her back, broken by ice and old scars. Her muzzle was silvered almost white, not with age alone, but with the salt-washed look of hardship. One ear stood high, the other folded slightly at the tip. She turned when Reed stepped onto the porch. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her ribs showed. Blood had dried near one shoulder where the fur grew thin around an old scar split open by travel. One paw lifted and touched the door again, not wildly this time, but with purpose. Her amber eyes fixed on Reed. Not begging, reporting. Reed felt something old tighten beneath his ribs. "Easy," he said. The dog flinched at the sound, then held her ground. "That's not an answer," Reed muttered, though he was not sure whether he was talking to her or to himself. He opened the door. The shepherd did not rush inside. That told him more than panic would have. She lowered her head, smelled the threshold, looked past him into the cabin, then stepped in with the caution of an animal that remembered rules even after the world had stopped honoring them. Snow fell from her coat in clumps onto the floorboards. Reed closed the door against the storm. The cabin changed at once. It had contained cold, wood smoke, coffee, machine oil, and one man's stubborn quiet. Now it contained breath, need, pain. The dog stood near the mat, trembling so hard her legs clicked faintly against each other. Reed did not touch her right away. He moved to the stove, added 2 pieces of cedar, and waited until flame took. Then he set a bowl of water near the hearth and opened a can of sardines he kept for emergencies. The shepherd watched his hands, not the food. That, too, told him something. "You trained?" he asked quietly. Her ears shifted. Reed set the sardines down and backed away. Only then did she eat, slow at first, then with a hunger she tried to hide and failed. When the bowl was empty, she licked the metal once, then stopped herself, as though dignity had returned late but insisted on being counted. Reed almost smiled. Almost. He took the first aid kit from the cabinet and sat on the floor several feet away. "I need to look at that shoulder." The shepherd stared. He opened the kit slowly, laid out gauze, antiseptic, bandage wrap. His hands did not shake. They rarely did when there was a task. "You can bite me if you need to," he said. "Wouldn't recommend it. I'm mostly bone and bad decisions." The dog did not bite. She let him come near, but when his hand moved toward her neck, she jerked back so fast her claws scratched the floor. Reed froze. "All right," he said. "Not there." Her breath came hard. Her eyes had gone somewhere else, some road, some hand, some collar pulled too tight. Reed lowered his hand and waited. The storm pressed against the windows. The radio whispered on the table. Snow melted from the dog's coat and ran in thin lines across the floor like small, defeated rivers. After a while, the shepherd leaned forward just enough for him to reach her shoulder. He cleaned the wound. She trembled, but stayed. There were old marks under the fur, healed cuts, pressure scars, places where skin had learned to close without ever forgetting. Reed wrapped the shoulder carefully, not tight enough to trap heat, not loose enough to fall off. When he finished, he reached for the towel to dry the snow under her chest. That was when he saw the tag. It hung from a cracked brown leather collar half hidden beneath the wet fur. A small metal plate, bent at one corner, scratched nearly smooth. Reed turned it gently with 2 fingers, careful not to pull. The letters were faint but legible. Tally. Frost 12. Weather Archive. Reed stopped breathing for a moment. The cabin seemed to draw back around him. The stove, the mug, the firewood, the floor under his knees, all of it grew distant. Frost-12. He knew that code, not from paperwork, not from town gossip. From the radio years ago, when storms still had names and voices, still called him before the worst happened. Frost 12 had been a weather archive cabin above the Olympic foothills, part of an old volunteer warning network that tracked snowpack, river rise, wind shifts, and coastal pressure before the official systems caught up. Reed had heard the call sign during landslide watches. Ferry rescues, flood warnings. He remembered a man's voice attached to it, rough, sharp, amused by danger in the way only careful men could afford to be. Asa Frost, storm watcher, volunteer, the kind of man who could read a creek by sound and make a joke while telling 3 families to leave their homes before midnight. Reed had never met him face to face. He had heard when Asa died. Everyone in the network had. Reed looked at the shepherd. Tally, he said. At the name, something changed in her. Not joy, not relief exactly. A smaller thing, more painful. Recognition. As if the sound had traveled a very long way and arrived with snow on its shoulders. Her tail moved once against the floor. Reed sat back on his heels. So you're his. Tally looked toward the door, not the food, not the fire. The door. Reed followed her gaze and felt the old resistance rise inside him like a wall. No, he said. Tally did not move. No, he repeated, quieter this time, because the first one had sounded too much like fear. The dog lowered her head, crossed the room with slow stiffness, and stood beside the front door. She lifted one bandaged paw and set it against the wood. One touch. Then she looked back at him. Reed's jaw tightened. He knew that look, not from dogs only, from men waiting for extraction, from a woman on a flooded road holding a radio with both hands, from voices that came through static saying, "Can anyone hear me?" He stood too quickly, and pain flared through his knee. "Whoever sent you," he said, "picked the wrong house." Tally remained by the door. The storm answered for her, bright and violent against the glass. That afternoon, Reed tried to do what a sensible man would do. He checked the county emergency frequency, nothing but static. He tried the ranger channel, a burst of broken sound, then wind. He adjusted the antenna, turned the dial by touch, and listened. At first there was only the storm speaking in its 1,000 white tongues. Then, beneath the static, came a faint human sound. A cough. Reed went still. The radio crackled. A woman's voice, weak and broken by distance, slipped through for less than 2 seconds. "Frost. Still here." The signal vanished. Reed did not move. Tally had lifted her head from the rug near the stove. Her ears were forward, the good one sharp as a blade, the bent one trembling. Reed turned the dial back, then forward, searching. Nothing. He wrote the frequency on the notepad beside the radio. His handwriting looked harsher than usual. Outside, snow thickened. The road was gone now, buried beneath a smooth white skin. The trees leaned close, their branches heavy, whispering like old witnesses who had seen men make promises and break them before. Reed sat at the table until dark, one hand on the radio, the other resting near the bent metal tag he had cleaned and placed beside his mug while Tally slept. Tally. Frost, 12, Weather Archive. A name, a place, a warning. He had built his life around not answering warnings unless they came with engines he could repair. A generator did not ask why a man had disappeared. A radio did not care whether the hand turning its dial had failed someone once. Snowmobiles did not look at him with disappointment, but a dog did. Tally woke before dawn. Reed knew because the cabin became alert before his eyes opened. The fire had burned low. Blue light pressed at the windows. The storm had not stopped, but it had changed shape. Less rage now, more resolve. He sat up on the cot. Tally stood near the door, the bandage on her shoulder white against her black and gold coat. She looked worse in daylight and stronger at the same time. Too thin, too scarred, too steady. Reed pulled on his boots without speaking. He made coffee. Packed gauze, rope, batteries, a flare, 2 protein bars, a folding shovel, and the old handheld radio. He clipped the radio strap across his chest over the olive combat shirt, then pulled on his parka. The familiar weight settled against him, half armor, half accusation. At the door, he paused. "You understand," he said to Tally. "I'm not promising anything." The shepherd stepped onto the porch. Snow swallowed her pause. She moved to the edge of the clearing, turned toward the white forest, and looked back. Reed stood in the doorway of the life he had built, from distance, numbers, and locked silence. Behind him waited warmth, counted firewood, soup cans, the mercy of objects. Ahead of him waited the mountain, a broken signal, a name he had not heard in years, and a dog who had crossed a storm not to be saved, but to deliver him to someone still being taken by winter. Reed closed the cabin door. Then he followed Tally into the snow. Tally did not choose the road. That was the first thing Reed noticed. The old logging track beyond his cabin ran north in a pale, obvious line, half buried under fresh snow. It would have been the human choice, the clean choice, the one any map would have approved of before betraying a man halfway up the ridge. Tally ignored it. She moved instead through the firs, keeping to the shoulder of the slope where the wind had packed the snow hard beneath a crust of ice. She did not hurry. Her injured shoulder made every fourth step uneven, but she placed her paws with the care of a creature who knew winter punished arrogance before ignorance. Reed followed with the old radio strapped across his chest and the folding shovel lashed to his pack. His slate-gray parka pulled tight around him. Beneath it, the olive-drab combat shirt held warmth close to his body, the camouflage sleeves brushing against the straps of his gear. Snow caught in the silver at his temples and melted slowly along his jaw. The forest was bright in a way that felt almost holy and almost hostile. Sunlight broke through the storm clouds in scattered flashes, turning the snowfields between the trees into sheets of white fire. The hemlock stood heavy-shouldered beneath their burdens. Now and then, a branch released its load with a soft thunder, and powder fell in curtains around them. Tally stopped each time before the snow dropped. Not after. Before. Reed watched her ears, one sharp, one bent, and felt his old training stir awake in a place beneath thought. She was not merely following scent. She was reading weight, wind, the complaint of branches, the difference between silence and pressure. Whoever had trained her had not wasted love. Frost did good work, Reed said. Tally glanced back once. The name had reached her, not like a command, like a hand laid gently on an old scar. They moved on. A mile above the cabin, the land began to change. The trees thinned, and the slope opened toward a creek bed glazed with blue ice. Reed expected Tally to cross at the narrowest point. She did not. She led him downstream, where a fallen cedar bridged the water in a black-brown arc. Halfway across, Reed saw why. The snow over the creek upstream had collapsed in a clean oval. Thin ice, hidden water, a trap wearing a blanket. He stood for a moment on the cedar trunk, one gloved hand against a branch, and looked at the place he might have stepped if he had trusted the easy path. Tally waited on the far side, amber eyes steady. "All right," Reed muttered. "You get 1 point." Her tail did not move. Apparently, she was keeping a larger score. Past the creek, they found the first sign of human work. A trail marker had been ripped from its post and thrown downhill. Reed picked it up from the snow. The orange paint was old on the front, but the split wood at the back was fresh and pale. Someone had not simply missed the marker in a storm. Someone had torn it out. A little farther on, a new sign stood crooked in the snow. "Temporary hazard area. Minor slide risk. Do not enter." The letters were black and neat. Too neat. Reed crouched and scraped snow from the base of the signpost. The hole around it had not frozen properly. It had been planted recently, after the last hard freeze. He looked toward the slope above. No slide path, no broken trees, no fan of debris, nothing but wind-carved snow and a few ravens turning in the bright distance like scraps of burned paper. Tally sniffed the sign, then sneezed as if offended by bureaucracy. Reed almost smiled again. This time it came closer. "Yeah," he said, "I don't like it either." They climbed. By noon, the sky had cleared enough to reveal pieces of the Olympic ridgeline, blue-white and immense beyond the trees. The world below opened in glimpses. Dark forest, Silver Creek, a valley roofed in mist, and far beyond it, the pale suggestion of coastal water where winter light lay flat as hammered tin. Then Tally stopped. She stood at the edge of an old service road that should have led toward the archive cabin. Instead, the road was sealed beneath a wide glaze of ice, smooth and thick, shining with a dangerous beauty. Reed stepped closer and saw water trapped under it in cloudy veins. At the uphill ditch, a culvert had been packed full of limbs, mud and stones. Not by chance. Reed knelt, pulling off one glove with his teeth so he could feel the edges. Fresh cuts on the branches. Saw marks. A shallow track where a machine had backed in and out before the snow covered most of the evidence. He looked at the ice sheet across the road. A man did not need to lock a door if he understood water. Block the drainage. Let daytime thaw spill across the road. Let night freeze it into glass. Put up a hazard sign. Tell officials the route was unsafe. Let weather become the jailer. Reed's breath clouded the air. "Clever," he said softly. It was not praise. Tally moved past him, careful along the edge of the ice, toward a line of firs sheltering the upper trail. Her bandage had darkened where the wound seeped through. Reed did not like that. He liked even less that she refused to slow when he said her name. For the first time since leaving home, he wondered whether she would run until she fell, and whether he had followed her only to watch another loyal thing spend itself on someone else's emergency. He caught up and stepped in front of her. "No." Tally stopped. Reed pointed to a stump beside the trail. 2 minutes." She stared at him. He stared back. The mountain wind moved between them, carrying the scent of sap, snow, wet stone, and something faintly metallic from the old road. "You can glare all you want," he said. "You drop, I carry you. You won't enjoy my bedside manner." Tally's chest rose and fell. For a long moment she seemed to consider disobeying him. Then she turned, stiffly, and sat beside the stump. Reed took out gauze and checked her shoulder. The bleeding had not worsened badly, but the skin around the old scar was angry. He replaced the wrap, fingers slow, giving her every chance to pull away. When his hand brushed the edge of her collar, she tensed, but did not snap. That was new, not trust yet. A door unlatched somewhere in the dark. The bent metal tag tapped softly against his knuckle. Tally. Frost 12. Weather Archive. Reed looked at it, then at the ice-choked road below. Somewhere ahead, a woman had coughed into a dying signal. Somewhere ahead, the name Frost still had weight. And this dog, wounded and half-starved, had crossed through storm and timber to find a man who had spent years making himself unavailable. He wanted, suddenly and sharply, to be angry at Asa Frost, at a dead man, at a stranger who had trained a dog to believe people answered when called. "Damn you," Reed whispered. Tally lifted her eyes. He was not sure whether he had meant Asa, the mountain, himself, or the whole old religion of rescue. They moved again. The archive cabin appeared not all at once, but in fragments. First the low weather mast, leaning against the sky with its wires slack. Then the roofline under a heavy white cap, then a square window filmed with frost from the inside. At last the whole building emerged from between the trees, small and stubborn on the shoulder of the mountain, facing the valley like a watchman too old to leave his post. The place looked less like a cabin than a memory that had learned carpentry. Its walls were cedar, darkened by decades of rain and salt wind. The metal roof had patches of rust near the chimney. A narrow porch sagged slightly on the right side. Beside the door hung a wooden sign almost hidden by ice. Frost 12 Olympic Coast Weather Archive. Keep logs dry, keep radio clear. Reed read the last line twice. Tally went to the door and pawed once at the bottom. No answer came. Reed climbed the porch steps. The lock had frozen under a shell of ice. He knocked hard. "Hello inside. Reed Kincaid. I picked up a signal." For several seconds, only the wind replied. Then something moved inside. Not footsteps. A scrape. A chair leg, maybe. Reed pulled the small pry bar from his pack and broke ice away from the jam. He worked carefully at first. Then, when a weak sound came through the door, a cough, human and ragged, careful became fast. The door gave with a crack of frozen wood. Cold came out. That was wrong. Cabins opened into warmth if someone had been alive in them long enough. This cold rolled out deep and stale, carrying the smell of old paper, smoke that had died hours ago, damp wool, and fear kept too quiet. Tally slipped past Reed. "Tally!" a woman's voice rasped. The dog stopped as if struck. A woman sat on the floor near a dead iron stove, wrapped in a blanket striped red and gray. She was in her 40s, though exhaustion had pulled the bones of her face sharper. Her brown ash hair had come loose from a low tie, and strands clung to her cheek. A pair of thin reading glasses hung from a cord around her neck. Her lips were pale. Her eyes, gray-blue and fever-bright, fixed on the dog with an expression Reed did not know how to name. Not surprise, not relief. Recognition so deep it hurt to witness. "Tally," she whispered again. The shepherd crossed the room and pressed her head against the woman's chest. Only then did Delia Frost break. She did not sob loudly. She folded one hand into the fur behind Tally's ear and bowed over her, trembling without sound, as if grief had been waiting for permission and found it in the body of a dog. Reed stood in the doorway, snow blowing around his boots, suddenly aware he had stepped into a reunion that did not belong to him. He shut the door. The cabin was crowded with boxes, maps, rolled charts, metal shelves, and notebooks stacked in careful towers. A battery lantern glowed weakly on the table. Along one wall hung hand-drawn river maps, marked in blue pencil. Snowpack charts yellowed with age were clipped beside ferry incident reports and old radio call sheets. Labels covered everything. Lower Skokomish, flood years, coastal pressure logs, ferry rescue, audio spring thaw, runoff, ASAF, field books, do not remove. Reed took in the room with the quickness of habit. Dead stove, Low supplies. Frost inside the window. One cot unused, buried under files. A cracked mug on the floor. No visible blood. No immediate attacker. One woman near hypothermia. One dog already too invested. He moved to the stove. When did it go out? The woman blinked as if remembering he existed. Last night, maybe before dawn. I tried to save the last kindling. Her voice was dry but educated, shaped by classrooms, archives, and arguments she usually won before raising it. "Delia Frost?" Reed asked. She nodded once. Her hand remained buried in Tally's fur. "Can you stand?" "That depends on whether you need honesty or optimism." Reed glanced at her. Even half-frozen, she had teeth. "Honesty." "Not well." "Good, don't." He set to work, wood first, draft second. Chimney checked with a mirror and flashlight. The flue was sluggish but not blocked. He scraped ash, fed cedar shavings into the stove, coaxed flame, then added split wood from the small indoor rack. The first fire caught reluctantly, like an old man agreeing to one more duty. Warmth began to think about returning. Delia watched him through the wavering light. "You followed her." "She insisted." "She does that?" "She yours?" The question landed badly. Reed knew it as soon as it left his mouth. Delia looked down at Tally. Her thumb moved over the dog's bent ear. "She was my brother's." "Asa." Delia's eyes lifted. "You knew him?" "Voice only. Radio network." The corner of her mouth tried to move and failed. "That sounds right. Asa existed mostly as a voice in bad weather." Tally leaned harder against her. Reed took a silver emergency blanket from his pack and unfolded it. "You need heat." "I need these files protected." "You need a pulse first." "That too." He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She accepted it, but her eyes moved at once to the shelves, counting the boxes like a mother counting children after a fire. Reed had seen that look before. People said they were guarding property, paperwork, equipment. Sometimes they were guarding the last proof that someone's life had mattered. "What happened to the road?" he asked. Delia's face changed. Northline Timber happened. The name meant little to Reed personally, but he had seen their signs along county roads. Clean green lettering, trees stylized into something obedient, slogans about stewardship and renewal printed on banners tied to machinery. Delia reached toward the table, missed the first time, then caught a folder. Reed took it before she could drop it. "Careful," he said. "Careful is what they call delay when they want you to feel unreasonable." He opened the folder. Maps, permits, a proposed timber access route cutting above several feeder streams, notes in different hands, some typed, some written in pencil, water rights, flow records, seasonal flood histories, names of farms and ferry docks down valley. Delia spoke while he scanned. "They want the North Spur approved before spring thaw. If ASA's flow records are accepted, the state will require a full hydrological review. That means delays, changes, maybe denial. And the archive blocks that. The archive remembers what their consultants forgot to mention." Outside, wind struck the cabin hard enough to shake snow from the roof. Reed looked toward the window. Through the frost he could see the weather mast, its lines cut and hanging. Delia followed his gaze. "They filed an emergency notice, said the cabin was unstable, said the materials should be moved for preservation." "But they didn't come get you?" "I came up before they expected me to. I thought I had a day." A bitter little laugh escaped her. Historians are famous for underestimating men with trucks. Reed closed the folder. "We leave when you can move. Files later." "No." It was not loud. It did not need to be. Reed turned slowly. "You're cold, weak, and cut off. And if I leave, they'll move the boxes before anyone from the county arrives. You can't guard paper with your body." That is exactly what people say right before paper disappears. The stove popped. Tally lifted her head. Reed felt his patience thinning, not because Delia was wrong, but because she was too willing to be dead right. "I didn't come up here to argue archive ethics," he said. "Your signal came through my radio. The dog found me. That makes getting you down my problem." Delia's eyes sharpened. "No, it makes you the first person who heard." The word struck harder than accusation would have. The first person who heard. Reed looked away. There were phrases a man carried without knowing he carried them. Voices beneath static. Calls unanswered. A name repeated too late. He had built walls around those sounds, and this half-frozen woman had just opened a window. Tally rose. Slowly, with effort, she stepped between them. She did not bark. She did not lean on Delia or Reed. She simply stood in the narrow space between the man who wanted to retreat into action and the woman who wanted to turn guilt into martyrdom. Her ribs showed under the bandage. Her muzzle was white with age and storm. She looked too tired to command anyone. Yet the cabin obeyed. Reed said nothing. Delia looked down at the dog, and something in her face softened into pain. "She waited for him," Delia whispered. Reed did not ask who. "Asa, after the slide. They told me she kept going back to the relay trail. Every day for 2 weeks. Then the rescue network folded its field unit. Funding, liability, all those clean words. No one knew whose dog she legally was. I was in Oregon by then, pretending grief had a forwarding address." Tally's bent ear twitched at Asa's name. Delia swallowed. "A man at the old bait shop fed her sometimes. Someone else left scraps near the ferry lot. She became a rumor with paws." Reed looked at the dog. A rumor with paws. That was too close to what he had become. A man people mentioned when something needed fixing, but no one expected at a table. Delia pulled the silver blanket tighter. "She found you because Asa trained her to find the person who could still answer." Reed's mouth went dry. "That's a lot to put on a dog," he said. "It's a lot to put on anyone." For a while, none of them spoke. The fire strengthened. Water dripped from Reed's parka onto the floor. The maps on the walls fluttered faintly with each breath the cabin took through its seams. Outside, snow shone against the window, bright as bone. At last, Reed set his pack on the table. "We stabilize you," he said. "We document what's here. I try to raise someone again once the radio's warm. Nobody moves until we know the route." Delia studied him. "That is not leaving?" "No." "It is also not surrendering the archive." "No." A small, exhausted smile touched her mouth. "You negotiate like a man who hates calling it compromise." "I negotiate like a man who likes people alive." Tally sat down between them. It was the first sensible thing anyone had done all day. Reed found a tin of tea in the cabinet, old but usable, and heated water in a dented pot. Delia drank with both hands around the mug. Color returned slowly to her face. Not enough, but some. Reed checked the cabin supplies. 2 cans of beans, half a bag of oats, matches. Batteries mostly drained, lantern weak, medical kit poor, too many files, not enough fuel. He went to the door and looked out at the buried service road, the cut weather mast, the ice sealing the lower track, and the valley shining far below, innocent because distance made everything innocent. Delia spoke behind him. This place kept people alive before they knew they were in danger. Reed looked back. She sat near the stove, Tally's head resting across her knee, one hand on the dog's collar, but not touching the scarred part of her neck. The room was still cold, still crowded, still threatened by men who understood paperwork better than mercy. But the fire had taken. The dog had stopped shaking. The woman was awake. For the moment, that was a kind of victory. What did Asa always say? Delia murmured, more to Tally than to Reed. "Listen before the water rises." Tally closed her eyes. Reed stood in the doorway with the storm beyond him and the archive behind him, and understood that he had not found a cabin full of old weather. He had found a place where warnings had been loved enough to be kept. And now, whether he liked it or not, one of those warnings had become his. Night arrived early at frost 12. It did not fall from the sky so much as climb out of the trees, darkening the trunks first, then the snowbanks, then the corners of the cabin where the lantern could not reach. Outside, the wind moved around the walls with a low, steady patience. It did not rage now. It waited. Reed trusted waiting weather less than angry weather. Anger spent itself. Waiting gathered interest. He fed another split of cedar into the stove and watched the flame take. The iron box ticked as heat moved through it. Beside the stove, Delia Frost sat wrapped in the silver emergency blanket and Asa's old red-gray wool blanket, her hands around a dented mug of weak tea. Color had returned to her face in patches, though her lips still held a faint blue shadow. Tally lay between them and the door. Not asleep, never asleep in the way house dogs slept. Her body was down, but her ears kept working. The straight one followed the wind. The bent one twitched whenever Delia coughed. Her bandaged shoulder rose and fell with slow effort, and every so often her amber eyes opened to check whether both humans remained where she had left them. Reed noticed. He was trying not to. The cabin had a kind of order that did not belong to comfort. It belonged to vigilance. Shelves covered 2 walls, stacked with field books, waterproof binders, rolled maps, cassette cases, hard drives in padded boxes, and plastic tubs labeled in careful block letters. Nothing decorative hung on the walls unless it had once saved someone's life. River maps, tide tables, snowpack histories, radio schedules, photographs of washed-out bridges, a list of ferry captains and emergency frequencies from years when phones could not be trusted beyond the first ridge. A place like this should have smelled like dust and old paper. Instead, beneath the cedar smoke and damp wool, Reed could smell something else. Cold metal, burned insulation, battery acid, faint but wrong. He followed it to the radio table. The main set was an old base unit, heavy, ugly, dependable looking. Its casing had scratches along one side, and someone had taped a handwritten note across the top. If it talks back, write it down. Reed touched the note with one gloved finger. The handwriting was bold, slanted, impatient. "Asa," Delia said behind him. Reed did not turn. "Sounds like him. You only knew him by radio." That was enough for some people. Delia was quiet for a moment. Reed knelt and pulled the lower access panel from the radio desk. The wiring inside had been arranged by someone who understood both order and desperation. Bundled cables, labeled lines, backup battery feed, ground wire, external antenna, a secondary patch to an old relay channel. Then there was the other wire. Too new, too clean. Reed narrowed his eyes. It had been spliced into the battery line with a small load device tucked behind the wood frame, the kind that could drain a backup system slowly without making anything look broken at first glance. Not sabotage with a hammer, sabotage with manners. He followed the line with a flashlight. The external antenna cable had been cut behind the wall, where a casual inspection would not find it. The cut was clean, flattened at the edges, side cutters. He sat back on his heels. Delia watched him. Storm damage? No. She closed her eyes briefly. Not surprise. Confirmation. That was what I thought, she said. Someone wanted the cabin quiet. Not destroyed? No. Reed looked at the dead radio. Destroyed leaves a body. Quiet leaves a question. Outside, snow scraped along the window like fingernails. Delia's fingers tightened around the mug. That sounds like North Line. Reed opened his mouth to ask more, then stopped. Delia was already pale again, Her body needed heat more than questions, but there were times a mind kept a person alive when a blanket could not. He pulled a stool near the radio table and began stripping the damaged wire. "Talk," he said. Delia blinked. "That your bedside manner? I warned the dog it was bad." A small breath left her, almost a laugh. It warmed the room more than it should have. She looked down into her tea. Asa used to say water had a memory. Reed twisted copper between his fingers. Poetic? He meant it literally half the time. Flood marks on cedar trunks, gravel bars moved after a heavy thaw, moss lines under bridges, old ferry pilots remembering which fog meant wait and which fog meant move now. Her gaze drifted to the maps. He believed a place kept records even when people threw theirs away. Reed reached for electrical tape. "And you?" "I believed my brother needed a hobby that did not involve freezing to death on ridges." The honesty in it was sharp enough to cut. Delia set the mug on the floor beside her. Tally opened one eye until Delia's hand rested lightly on her back. Only then did the dog settle again. "I was in Oregon when Asa died," Delia said, "teaching a short course on maritime migration records, warm lecture hall, bad coffee, a room full of people pretending footnotes were a form of oxygen." She swallowed. "He had called me the week before. I didn't answer." Reed's hand stilled. The cabin seemed to hear that. Delia looked up, and something in her expression told him she knew exactly why the sentence had found him. Not the details, maybe not even the shape, but grief had a way of recognizing its own uniform under civilian clothes. "He left a message," she continued, "something about Northline consultants misreading tributary behavior." I remember rolling my eyes before I even listened. That was our language by then. He warned. I rolled my eyes. He kept records. I told him records were not people. Her voice lowered. Then he was gone, and all that was left of him was records. Reed turned back to the wires, because looking at her would have required an answer he did not have. The radio hissed faintly when he connected the temporary patch to the emergency battery. Not enough, but not dead. He adjusted the dial. Static lifted in the room like dry leaves. Tally raised her head. Reed held up a hand, not to command the dog, but because his own pulse had changed. The static broke once, a tone, then nothing. Delia leaned forward. Was that carrier bounce, maybe? Maybe means yes when men don't want to hope. Maybe means maybe. He tried the lower band, then the old volunteer frequency marked in faded ink on the desk. The base unit was too weak. The external antenna was cut. But short-range transmission might still crawl downhill if the clouds and ridges were feeling generous. He keyed the microphone. "This is Reed Kincaid at Frost 12 Weather Archive. Anyone receiving on local relay, respond." Static. He waited. The stove ticked. Delia held her breath. Tally stood slowly, as if the room itself had changed altitude. Reed tried again. "Frost 1-2, emergency traffic. 2 civilians at archive cabin, 1 injured animal, road access compromised. Need relay confirmation." A long hiss answered. Then a voice burst through, broken but unmistakably human. "Well, I'll be cursed and thawed." "Kincaid?" Reed closed his eyes for half a second, not from relief, from recognition he was not ready to welcome. "Hector," he said. The voice crackled, rough as gravel in a coffee can. "No, it's the Virgin Mary with a bad alternator. What in God's wet pocket are you doing on that frequency?" Delia stared at the radio. Reed pressed the transmit button. "At Frost 12. A pause. When Hector Wynne came back, the humor had gone thin. "Say again." "Frost 12. Alone?" "No." Another pause, full of old things. "Of course not. You never did pick easy places to haunt." Reed looked toward the window instead of at Delia. Need parts. Antenna line cut. Backup drained. Cabin occupied by Delia Frost. She's cold but conscious. Dog is injured. Dog? Tally? This time the silence was different. Even through static, Reed heard Hector sit with the name. "Well," Hector said at last, quieter. "That old girl's still breathing." Delia's hand covered her mouth. "You know her?" she asked. Reed lifted the mic. "Delia wants to know if you know the dog." Hector gave a soft snort. Everybody with a radio and half a conscience knew Tally. Asa used to say she had more sense than the entire county board, and I never found evidence against it. Tally's tail moved once against the floor. Delia looked down at her as if that single sound had reached some locked chamber in her chest. Reed keyed the mic again. "Can you get up here? In this weather, I can get halfway up and regret my birth, which is apparently the standard plan when you're involved." Hector coughed away from the mic. "I've got a snow rig, a coil of antenna cable, connectors, spare battery pack. But listen close. Northline filed a slide risk notice this morning. Ranger access is tangled in red tape." "Ranger who?" "Marin Quaid, district ranger, hair like a knife, face like she was carved by a river that didn't like the rock. She's trying to get eyes on that slope, but the cabin's on old county transfer land, so she can't just kick the gate and call it federal oversight." Delia muttered, "Convenient." "Convenient is Northline's native language," Hector said, apparently hearing enough. They also told dispatch the archive structure may be unsafe for material preservation. Delia sat straighter despite the blanket. "Material preservation?" Reed saw anger put heat into her faster than the stove had. "Means they're setting up to move files," he said. "Or say they tried if files vanish first," Hector added. Reed pinched the bridge of his nose. "Can you reach Quaid?" "I can try. She listens to me when she's desperate, drunk, or out of better options. Today may qualify for 1.5. Delia leaned toward the radio. Reed handed her the mic after a moment's hesitation. "Hector Wynne," she said. "That voice better be Delia Frost, or I'm about to be haunted by 3 members of one family." "It's Delia." "Then sit near a stove and let Kincaid do something useful. You sound like a ghost arguing with a librarian." "I am a librarian in spirit?" "Figures." The smallest smile touched Delia's face. This one stayed a little longer. Then she said, "Hector, the archive can't leave the mountain." The radio hissed. When he answered, his voice had lost all joking. "I know." Those 2 words settled over the room. Reed looked from Delia to the shelves, from the shelves to the dog, from the dog to the patched radio. For the first time since he had left his own cabin, the problem stopped being a line from point A to point B. It became a web: people, records, jurisdiction, weather. A company using paperwork the way some men used knives. And somewhere inside that web, Reed's name had been pulled tight again. He did not like it, but he could feel it holding. Hector promised to try the lower road before dark and signaled off with a warning to keep transmissions short. "If the battery dies, Kincaid, I'm blaming you personally. If you die, I'm also blaming you personally, which will be less satisfying but more traditional." The radio fell back into static. The cabin felt larger afterward, not safer exactly, but less alone. Reed spent the next hour working through the cabin like a man repairing a small ship before night seas. He sealed the worst window gap with plastic sheet and duct tape. He cleared a partial blockage in the chimney where a bird nest and ice had narrowed the draft. He dragged the remaining dry wood closer to the stove and cut 2 broken shelf boards into kindling with Delia's reluctant permission. "Those shelves are original," she said. "They're also warm now." "That is barbaric." "Useful barbarism." "Asa would have liked you." "No, he wouldn't." Delia studied him. "You sure?" Reed said nothing. Tally, lying near the stove, gave a soft breath that sounded suspiciously like judgment. Food came next. Reed divided what they had with military precision and mountain practicality. Oats with melted snow. Beans warmed in the can. Half a protein bar for Delia, because she needed sugar and he did not want to hear her argue about it. Tally got a small portion at a time, enough not to shock an empty stomach. Delia watched him break the food into portions. "You do that as if the cans are going to report you for waste." "They might." "You always like this?" "No." The answer slipped out before he could stop it. Delia did not pounce on it. That earned her more respect than any apology would have. The night deepened. Outside, the wind shifted west. Reed could tell by the way it struck the roof and by the low moan inside the weather mast. Delia heard it too. Her eyes moved toward a row of notebooks marked Wind Events, West Face. "Asa would have written that down," she said. "Probably." "He said west wind after a bright storm meant trouble in the gullies?" Reed glanced toward the dark window. "He say it like prophecy?" "No, like maintenance advice from God." That got him, not a laugh, but close enough to soften his mouth. Delia saw and wisely pretended not to. Later, as Reed checked the door brace, Delia began speaking again. Not in confession now. More like someone opening boxes in herself and finding each one still labeled. "Asa and I fought the last time I saw him. Properly fought. Not one of those polite sibling things people describe at funerals." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I told him he was wasting his life recording weather for people who only remembered him when something went wrong. He told me I worked in archives and still didn't understand what memory was for." Reed slid the door bolt into place. Hard to win an argument with the dead. "It is impossible. They get terribly smug." He turned. Delia's eyes shone, but she was smiling, just barely. Grief and humor stood together in her face like two survivors sharing a doorway. Then the smile faded. "I came back because Northline requested removal access. I thought I was protecting Asa's work, but the truth is uglier. I came back because I was afraid the last thing I ever said to him might turn out to be the thing everyone else believed. That he wasted his life." "Yes." Reed had no comforting answer. Comfort, in his experience, was often a decorative blanket thrown over a broken beam. So he gave her the truth. If he saved people with this place, then it wasn't wasted. Delia looked at him for a long time. "You say that like you're trying to convince yourself of something else." Reed turned back to the door. "Drink your tea." "Ah," she said softly. "There he is." He almost told her to stop. Tally did it for him. The shepherd rose suddenly, not with alarm, but with a precise change in attention. She crossed to Delia, placed her head beneath the woman's loose hand, and breathed out slowly. Delia blinked. Her fingers had gone slack. The mug tilted dangerously. Reed moved fast, catching it before hot tea spilled across the blanket. "Delia? I'm fine." "You're not?" "I was only fading." The words silenced both of them. Delia's face had gone pale again, the earlier color drained as if someone had opened a hidden valve. Her eyes were focused, but too far away. Cold had a way of flattering the dying. It made them quiet, agreeable, almost peaceful. Reed hated that trick. He moved the stool closer to the stove and guided her upright. "Stay with me." "I am." "No, you're visiting." That reached her. A weak irritation sharpened her gaze. "That is a terrible thing to say to a historian." "Good, be offended awake." He heated more water, added sugar from an old tin, made her drink. Tally pressed close against Delia's knee, not pushing, simply anchoring. The dog breathed slow and deep, her ribs expanding under scarred fur. Delia's breathing, shallow and quick, began to follow. In, out, in, out. Reed watched it happen. Not magic, not miracle, rhythm. A wounded dog teaching a half-frozen woman the ancient discipline of staying. The room seemed to narrow to that small exchange. Tally's muzzle under Delia's hand, Delia's fingers finding fur, the stove throwing orange light across maps of rivers that had risen and fallen long before any of them were born. Reed felt something in his chest shift, and he did not welcome it. He had thought Tally was loyal to the dead. Now he saw she was loyal to the living on behalf of the dead. That was worse. That could ask things of a man. When Delia's color improved again, Reed sat back on the floor beside the stove. His knee throbbed. His shoulders ached. His hands smelled of copper, ash, dog fur, and old paper. Tally looked at him. For once, she did not look away. "You make a habit of this?" he asked her quietly. "Keeping fools from disappearing?" Her tail tapped the floor once. Delia, eyes closed but not asleep, murmured, "She learned from the best?" Reed looked at the weather logs along the wall. Frost 12 had kept warnings because someone believed warnings mattered before proof became wreckage. Asa had listened to water, wind, snow, static. Delia had returned to listen too late, but she had returned. Hector was somewhere down mountain, cursing weather and gathering parts. Ranger Marin Quaid was pushing against red tape Reed could not yet see. And Tally, thin, scarred, discarded by paperwork and fed by pity, had refused to let silence have the final word. Near midnight, the radio gave one weak crackle. Reed reached it before the second. No voice came through, only static, a thin tone, and then a brief pulse like a relay trying to wake in its sleep. Delia opened her eyes. What was that? Reed adjusted the dial by a hair, listening. The pulse came again, higher this time, not from Hector's direction, not from the lower road, from above. He looked at the old frequency chart taped to the wall. A faded line connected Frost 12 to a mountaintop relay station marked in Asa's handwriting. Upper Ridge. Repeater manual reset. If dead, don't be lazy. Reed stared at the note. Delia followed his gaze, then closed her eyes with an expression halfway between despair and affection. My brother, she whispered, was unbearable. Reed listened as the pulse faded back into storm. The cabin settled. The stove burned. Tally lowered her head onto Delia's boot, as if the matter had been recorded and could wait until morning. Reed remained by the radio for a long time, one hand resting near the dial, the other on the edge of the table where Asa Frost had once left his impatient instructions to anyone still alive enough to read them. Outside, beyond the dark glass, the mountain kept its secrets. Inside, Frost 12 kept breathing. Morning did not bring warmth. It brought a cleaner kind of cold, the kind that made every sound seem guilty. The storm had thinned before dawn, leaving the mountain glazed in white silence. Frost 12 stood beneath its burden of snow like an old keeper at the edge of a forgotten kingdom. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, uncertain line. Inside, Delia Frost slept in short, shallow intervals near the stove, a blanket pulled to her chin, one hand resting loosely against Tally's back. Reed Kincaid had not slept. He had spent the last hour copying pages by lantern light. Snowfall logs, flowcharts, a hand-drawn map of feeder streams above the North Spur. One maintenance request with a note in Asa Frost's impatient hand. Culvert below Archive Road must remain clear during thaw cycles. Beside it, Delia had written a letter on stiff archival paper because even half-frozen, she seemed unable to use anything ordinary when a document mattered. To whom it may concern, she had begun. Reed had almost told her no one who mattered ever began by concerning themselves. He had not. Now he folded the copies into a waterproof pouch and tucked Delia's letter between them. Tally watched from beside the stove, ears shifting. She did not like him preparing to leave. He could see that in the way her eyes followed his gloves, his pack strap, the radio cord across his chest. "I'm not going far," he said. Tally did not look impressed. Delia opened one eye. She has heard men say that before. Reed paused with one hand on the door latch. The words were not cruel. That made them worse. "I meet Quaid at the lower tree line," he said. "Hand off copies. Come back. If you do not come back, I will be very annoyed. You'll be unconscious. I can be annoyed unconscious." That was the first thing she had said all morning that sounded like life instead of endurance. Reed looked at Tally. "Keep her warm." The shepherd rose stiffly and crossed to Delia, pressing her body against the blanket with careful weight, as if the command had been unnecessary but accepted for politeness. Reed stepped outside. The air bit into his lungs. The service road below remained a silver sheet, impossible for any sane vehicle. He took the upper side path, the one Tally had used, and moved down through the trees with the waterproof pouch inside his parka. The forest looked innocent after the storm. That was one of its old tricks. Snow covered the torn trail marker. Snow softened the fresh sign. Snow hid the tracks of whatever machine had blocked the culvert. A careless person might have seen only beauty. Reed saw erasure. At the edge of the marked closure, a woman stood beside a Green Ranger truck that had no business being as far up the road as it was. Marin Quaid did not wave. She stood with her boots planted in the snow, shoulders squared beneath a dark forest green shell jacket, radio clipped high on her left shoulder. Her short black hair, threaded with silver at the temples, stuck out from under a wool cap. Her face was lean and angular, weathered in the way of people who had spent half their life arguing with rain and winning often enough to continue. A yellow waterproof field notebook was tucked under one arm. She looked Reed up and down once. "Kincaid? Quaid? You look older. You look friendlier." "No, I don't." He handed her the pouch. Marin took it, but did not open it at once. Her eyes went past him, up toward the hidden cabin. "Delia alive?" "Yes." "Dog?" "Alive. Injured." Figures that dog would outlast 3 agencies and half the men who signed her paperwork. Reed said nothing. Marin opened the pouch and read Delia's letter first. Reed noticed that. Not the maps, not the data. The person's own statement. Whatever else Marin was, she understood which piece of paper had a pulse. Her mouth tightened as she moved to the copies. Culvert maintenance, snowpack runoff, North Spur stream behavior. She turned one page, then another. These are not enough. "I know." That made her glance up. "You do?" "I was hoping you wouldn't." "Hope is for tourists and grant writers." She tucked the pages back into the pouch. "This gives me cause to ask ugly questions. It does not give me authority to kick down Northline's office door." "You ever let authority stop you?" "I let jurisdiction stop me when it keeps the evidence alive." Marin looked toward the blocked road. "Cabin sits on old county transfer land. Federal boundary starts higher on the ridge and east of the drainage. Northline knows that. They filed the slide notice through county emergency access, not Forest Service. Neat little knot." Reed looked at the snow. Of course, the mountain had been locked not only with ice, but with borders no one could see. Marin pulled her radio and stepped away, speaking low into it. The response came in bursts, names, codes, delays. Permission refused politely enough to make a saint kick a door. When she returned, her face had not changed. Only her eyes had hardened. "I'm calling Leah Stroud." "That's supposed to mean something?" "It means this stops being a campfire story." 20 minutes later, Leah Stroud arrived in a county SUV with chains on the tires and no interest in the romance of weather. She stepped out wearing a black parka over a charcoal blazer, as if she had dressed for both court and avalanche. Her ash-blonde hair was cut clean at her jaw, one side pinned back. She carried a black waterproof document bag and walked across the snow with the impatient precision of someone who considered cold an administrative inconvenience. Marin briefed her in 4 sentences. Leah listened without interrupting. Reed respected that against his will. When Marin finished, Leah opened the pouch, scanned the copies, then looked at Reed. Who made these copies? Delia Frost. Who witnessed her condition? I did. Who blocked the culvert? Unknown. Unknown is not a person I can subpoena. Reed's jaw tightened. Leah did not soften. What proves Northline benefits if the archive becomes inaccessible before tomorrow's evidentiary window? Marin made a sound that was almost a laugh. There she is. Leah ignored her. I need motive, authority, and chain of custody. Right now we have a cold historian, a wounded dog, old records, a damaged road, and suspicions that may be correct but are not yet useful. Useful, Reed said. Leah looked at him. Yes, useful. Truth that cannot stand upright in a hearing is just weather. The words landed harder than Reed expected. He did not like her. He also understood why Marin had called her. Leah crouched by the hazard sign, photographed the new post, the unfrozen hole around it, the placement, the lack of slide debris uphill. She moved to the culvert and took more photos. Her gloves were leather, too polished for field work, but she did not hesitate to kneel in the snow when needed. Marin watched with dry approval. Reed watched the road. Every minute away from the cabin tightened something in him. He had left Delia, Tally, the archive, the weak stove, and the patched radio behind him. He knew it was necessary. He hated that necessity came dressed like abandonment. Leah rose. I need Delia's original statement, photos inside the cabin, and a list of missing or disturbed materials. She can barely stand, Reed said. I did not ask her to dance. Marin's mouth twitched. Reed did not smile. Road's ice. Then someone who can get up there gets it. As if summoned by insult, an engine coughed below them. Not a truck. Something older, angrier, and held together by grudge. A yellow snow rig climbed around the bend, rattling like a coffee can full of bolts. The machine had a narrow plow welded badly to the front, toolboxes strapped to both sides, and a small orange knit cap tied to the antenna like a warning flag. The driver killed the engine in a dramatic shudder and climbed down. Hector Wynne was built like a man assembled from spare parts that had all survived hard use. Stocky, broad-handed, red-faced from cold, with a thick salt and pepper mustache and a knit cap the color of burnt orange pulled low over his ears. He wore a brown oil-stained work jacket over a thermal shirt, and his tool bag looked heavy enough to anchor a small boat. He pointed at Reed immediately. You look terrible. Good morning. Don't waste those on me. Hector turned to Marin. Ranger. Hector. He looked at Leah. Lawyer? Leah Stroud. My condolences. To whom? Everyone eventually. Leah stared at him for 1 second, then looked at Marin. Is he useful? Unfortunately. Hector grinned, showing teeth stained by coffee and stubbornness. That's going on my stone. He did not ask where the cabin was. He knew. Reed saw that in the way Hector's eyes flicked toward the ridge with something older than concern. Men like Hector mapped places through breakdowns, generators fixed, batteries hauled, radios cursed back to life, lives kept ordinary by unromantic labor. Reed took one of the tool bags without asking. Hector let him. That was their apology for now. Getting back to Frost 12 took longer with Hector and equipment, but the old snow rig handled the upper path better than Reed expected. Marin stayed below with Leah to document the road and make calls no one wanted to receive. Reed rode the side step of the rig, one hand on the rail, watching the trees pass in white and black. Hector drove as if the machine owed him money. "You left," Hector said over the engine noise. Reed stared ahead. "This the time? Never found a better one. Road's narrow." So was the excuse. Reed said nothing. Hector snorted. "Fine, be a boarded-up church. See if I care." But he did care. That was the trouble with Hector. He made concern sound like vandalism. At the cabin, Tally was at the door before Reed touched the latch. She came out into the snow, limping but upright, and pressed her muzzle once against his thigh. Not affection. Inventory. He had returned. She recorded the fact. Hector saw her, and his face changed. All the joking fell away so cleanly it seemed like a coat slipping off his shoulders. "Well, old girl," he said softly, "you got skinny on us." Tally stared at him. Hector crouched slowly, knees cracking loud enough to offend the mountain. He held out one hand, palm down, not reaching. "I'm uglier than you remember. That's life. Don't make a sermon out of it." Tally sniffed his fingers. Then, after a long moment, she touched her nose to his knuckles. Hector blinked hard and looked away, fast. Dusty air. "It's snowing," Reed said. "Dusty snow." Inside, Delia greeted Hector with exhausted recognition and a lecture about not stepping on the lower Skokomish flood files. Hector told her she sounded exactly like Asa, which shut her up for nearly 4 seconds. That alone made his arrival valuable. The cabin changed under Hector's hands. Not healed, not saved, but awakened into work. He opened panels, tested lines, cursed the auxiliary drain device in language that made Delia briefly forget to be hypothermic, and confirmed Reed's suspicion. Somebody installed this to bleed the backup. He held the small device up between 2 thick fingers. Not a lot, just enough to make the batteries die like old age. Leah had asked for useful truth. This was useful. Reed photographed the device in place before Hector removed it. Delia labeled a paper evidence sleeve with a steadier hand than Reed liked. A person could be half frozen and still devoted to procedure if grief had trained her well enough. Hector moved to the shelves next. "Don't touch those," Delia said at once. "I am not touching. I am looking with my fingers nearby." That is touching in the future tense. "You archivists got rules for breathing near dust, too?" "Yes." Figures. But his joking faded as he studied the lock on the rear storage cabinet. "This isn't original." Delia pushed herself upright. "What?" "Secondary hasp. New screws. Wrong metal." Hector pointed. Asa used brass indoors because he said steel made cabinets look like jail cells. Delia stared. Reed photographed it. Hector opened the cabinet with a careful pick and a muttered apology to Asa's ghost. Inside were labeled tape cases, field books, and several empty slots. Delia gripped the back of a chair. "No," she said. Not loud, worse than loud. She moved toward the cabinet too quickly. Reed caught her elbow. She tried to pull away, then stopped because Tally had stood and blocked her knees. Delia looked down at the dog. I know. But her voice was breaking. She pointed to the empty spaces. Those were ferry rescue recordings, early thaw interviews, Asa's upper tributary warnings. She swallowed. And the duplicate index. Hector removed his cap and rubbed one hand over his flattened hair. Somebody knew what mattered. Reed looked at the shelves, the cut cable, the drained battery, the altered lock. This was no longer weather, negligence, or confusion. This was selection. Leah's 3 questions returned in his mind. What proves flow impact? Who has authority? Who benefits if the archive disappears? The missing tapes were an answer shaped like absence. Delia sank back into the chair, white-faced. Tally pressed her head beneath Delia's hand. This time, Delia held on. Asa made copies, she whispered. Hector looked up. Delia's eyes moved toward the weather chart wall. He did. He had to. He never trusted single points of failure. He said single copies were how cowards prayed to disaster. That sounds like him, Hector said. Where? Reed asked. Delia closed her eyes, searching exhaustion for memory. Upper Ridge Repeater. He kept emergency audio caches there, short voice logs, duplicates of calls he thought people might one day pretend never happened. Hector turned toward the window, toward the ridge hidden beyond cloud and white timber. Repeater's been dead 2 years. It pulsed last night, Reed said. Hector's eyebrows climbed. You sure? No. That means yes, coming from you. Delia opened her eyes. If the copies are there, they can prove Northline had warnings before filing their consultant report. Can we get to them remotely? Reed asked. Hector laughed once. No humor. That thing's older than 3 divorces and twice as bitter. Manual reset only if the relay board froze open. Asa built it like a genius raccoon. Delia whispered, manual reset if dead. Don't be lazy. Hector pointed at her. Exactly. Reed looked at the ridge again. The cold up there would not be like the trail below. It would be open wind, hard exposure, whiteout pockets, ice over rock. It was not a mission. Missions had teams, plans, extraction. This would be a man walking into weather with bad equipment and worse history because a dead man had been right too early. No, Reed said. Delia looked at him. Hector did too. Tally lifted her head. No, Reed repeated. Not today. Not in this wind. We stabilize the cabin. Get Leah the evidence we have. Wait for Marin to clear access. Hector's face held the rare seriousness of a man who preferred jokes because truth cost more. Access may not clear before Northline moves. Then we block the move here. With what? My charming personality? It has weight. Not legal weight. Delia stood, one hand on the table. Reed. No. Her voice softened. I am not asking you to die for my brother's files. That's good because I'm not. I am asking you to understand what happens if they leave this mountain. He turned on her too sharply. I understand plenty. I understand cold. I understand bad ground. I understand people calling for help when everybody thinks there's time. That ridge is not a symbol to me. It's a place that can kill you without caring why you climbed. The cabin went still. Delia looked as if she had been struck not by anger, but by the life underneath it. Hector lowered his eyes. Tally moved. She crossed to the corner where Asa's old blanket had been folded beneath a shelf. Nose down, she worked at something tucked behind it. Reed started toward her, thinking she had found a mouse or wire. Instead, Tally pulled out a strip of faded canvas. Blue-gray, frayed, stiff with age. She carried it to Reed and laid it across his boots. Delia covered her mouth. Hector whispered, Well, I'll be. Reed looked down. The canvas strip bore an old embroidered patch, partly torn but readable. Frost 12 Field Team. Delia's voice shook. That was from Asa's winter pack. Tally stood over the scrap, thin legs braced, amber eyes on Reed. Not commanding him, not begging, remembering in front of him. Reed felt the room press close, the files that could not defend themselves, the woman too tired to carry them alone, the old mechanic pretending his eyes were dry, the dog who had lost her handler and still believed the living could answer. He bent slowly and picked up the canvas. It smelled faintly of dust, dog fur, old smoke, and something almost gone. Not enough to be Asa. Enough to be absence. Reed folded the strip once and set it on the table beside the evidence sleeves. I said not today, he said quietly. No one spoke. He looked toward the ridge where the dead repeater waited above the trees. That doesn't mean never. By afternoon, Hector had restored limited power, enough to keep the stove fan turning and charge one battery pack. Reed photographed the altered lock, the empty tape slots, the battery drain device, the cut antenna line. Delia wrote a preliminary inventory of missing materials with Leah, listening over a weak patch of radio, her questions clipped and exact. Marin's voice came through once near dusk. "Hold position. Leah's filing an emergency preservation request. Northline has been notified not to remove materials pending review." "That will stop them?" Reed asked. A pause. "It will make removing them uglier." Hector muttered, "Law? The art of making sin inconvenient." Delia almost smiled. Tally slept at last, not deeply, but enough that her paws twitched once against the floor. Reed watched her from the radio table, the canvas patch lying near his hand. Outside, the sky darkened purple over the ridge. The repeater remained silent. But silence felt different now. Less like emptiness, more like a door that had not opened yet. Northline came up the mountain without sirens, without shouting, without the honest ugliness of men who knew they were stealing. They came with paperwork. That made it worse. By late afternoon, the weather had changed again. The sky turned white from ridge to ridge, not dark enough for night and not bright enough for day. Snow fell sideways, then upward, then in spinning sheets that erased the trees 10 yards beyond the porch. The world outside Frost 12 had become a blank page no one had asked permission to write on. Inside the cabin, the stove burned low, but steady. Hector Wynne was crouched near the radio table, muttering threats at a connector that had offended him personally. Delia Frost sat at the main table with a blanket over her shoulders, writing inventory numbers in a hand that grew smaller as she tired. Reed Kincaid stood near the window, watching the service road disappear and reappear through the storm. Tally stood before anyone heard the engine. Her head lifted from beside Delia's chair. One ear went sharp, the bent one trembled. Then she moved to the door, not barking, not whining, just standing with her bandaged shoulder forward and her black and gold body held still as a verdict. Reed touched the radio at his chest. "What?" Hector asked without looking up. "Visitors." A minute later, headlights surfaced below the cabin like pale fish under ice. 3 vehicles climbed slowly through the whiteout, 2 dark utility trucks and 1 box-bodied transport with chains on its tires. Their lights were dimmed low, not off completely, but muffled by snow and distance. No county plow. No ranger markings. No emergency beacon. Hector rose. "That ain't Marin." "No," Reed said. Delia put down her pencil. The sound was small. In the cabin, it landed like a dropped blade. The convoy stopped 20 yards from the porch. Doors opened. Figures stepped into the white. Men in winter work gear, clipboards, plastic storage crates, a private contractor logo on the side of the transport, half covered in snow. Then another man emerged from the lead truck. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and dressed too cleanly for the mountain. His black technical parka bore a small green Northline timber logo over the heart. His gloves were leather, his boots were spotless until the first step into snow, and somehow even then they looked insulted rather than dirty. His hair, brown-gray and combed back with practiced control, held its shape beneath a dark knit cap. He had the face of a man who had learned to let other people become emotional first. Reed knew before Delia said his name. Brant Voss. Hector whispered something that sounded like a prayer being dragged through a garage. Brant climbed the porch steps with a folder tucked under one arm and a calm smile arranged on his face. He knocked. That was what made Reed hate him immediately. Men who meant harm and still knocked believed manners were a kind of alibi. Reed opened the door halfway and filled the space with his body. Brant's eyes moved once over him. Silver at the temples, old parka, radio strap, combat shirt visible beneath, boots planted. The assessment was quick, clean, and filed away. Mr. Kincaid, I assume? Assume outside. Brant's smile did not falter. I am Brant Voss, Operations Director for Northline Timber. We are here under a county emergency preservation order to relocate vulnerable archival materials from this structure before the roof load and access conditions deteriorate further. Reed looked past him to the trucks. Convenient weather for preservation. Bad weather often forces responsible decisions. Delia's voice came from behind Reed. Responsible decisions usually introduce themselves before stealing. Brant's gaze shifted into the cabin. Miss Frost, he said with smooth concern, I am relieved to see you conscious. We were told you might be in distress. I am distressed by you. That is unfortunate, but not relevant to the condition of the materials. Hector snorted from the radio table. Man talks like a stapler got elected mayor. Brant ignored him. He held up the folder. This authorizes temporary removal and climate-controlled storage of designated items pending structural review. Reed did not take it. Delia stood too quickly. The blanket slipped from one shoulder. Tally moved at once, placing herself against Delia's legs. Delia put a hand on the dog's back, partly to steady Tally, partly because she needed steadying herself. Designated by whom? Delia asked. By the preservation assessment submitted to the county. There has been no preservation assessment inside this cabin. Brant's expression softened into something almost sorrowful. The exterior condition, access hazard, and your own medical vulnerability create a reasonable basis. My medical vulnerability is not your key. No, the county's signature is... The whiteout pressed against the windows. The cabin seemed to shrink around the papers, the shelves, the old maps on the walls. Reed could feel Hector's anger like heat behind him. Delia's was sharper, colder. His own sat low in his chest, heavy and familiar. Brant turned slightly and signaled to the men by the truck. Two contractors lifted plastic crates from the transport. Tally growled. Not loud. Enough. One of the men stopped. Brant's eyes lowered to her. Please secure the animal. She has a name, Delia said. Then please secure Tally. Reed stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. The move put him alone outside with Brant and the storm. It also gave Delia and Hector one more minute. Brant noticed. Reed saw him notice. Mr. Kincaid, Brant said, voice lower now, more private. I respect your background, truly, but this is not a rescue operation. It is an administrative action. Those kill people too. A faint crease appeared near Brant's mouth. Not anger. Disappointment that the lesser man had refused the offered script. The archive will be safer in professional storage. Which boxes? I beg your pardon? You said designated items. Which boxes? Brant opened the folder and showed him a list. Reed read it once. Spring thaw, runoff lower, Skulkamish, flood years, ferry rescue audio, North Spur, tributary field books, maintenance requests, road/culvert/relay, not everything, only what mattered. The storm moved through Reed's body with a cold clarity. Behind Brant, one of the contractors stood beside the transport, looking less certain than the others. He was a big man near Reed's age, maybe late 50s, with a gray beard trimmed short, a faded trucker cap under his hood, and hands thick from years of steering heavy machines. He kept glancing at the cabin sign. Reed looked back at Brant. That's a strange definition of vulnerable. It is a prioritized list. Of evidence, Brant closed the folder. Of materials at risk. The contractor by the truck took one slow step closer to the porch. Tally, he said, almost to himself. The dog's ears moved inside the cabin. Delia opened the door behind Reed, despite his silent wish that she would stay seated. Tally slipped out beside her, body tense but controlled. The contractor stared at the German shepherd. "I know that dog," he murmured. Brant turned. "Mr. Price, please remain with the vehicle." Nolan Price did not seem to hear him at first. Snow gathered on his shoulders. His brown transport jacket was worn shiny at the elbows, and a ring of keys hung heavy at his belt. He looked like a man who had spent his life being useful in ways no one remembered until something had to move. His eyes, brown and tired, stayed on Tally. "Frost's dog," Nolan said. Delia looked at him. "You knew Asa?" "My brother did," Nolan swallowed. "Ferry went sideways in a winter squall 12 years back. Asa called it early, got harbor men out before the radio tower lost power." His gaze lowered to Tally. "My brother said the dog kept barking at the dock gate until somebody listened." Tally stood still. Brant's voice sharpened by half an inch. "Nolan." That half inch told Reed more than anger would have. Nolan blinked, as if remembering who paid him. "Right. Sorry." But after that, his movements changed. He walked back to the transport and spent a very long time examining the rear tire chains. Hector stepped onto the porch behind Delia. "Problem with the rig?" Nolan did not look up. "Could be." Brant's jaw flexed. Reed felt the shape of the field shift. Not victory, not even advantage, but time, newly purchased by the memory of a ferry and a dog that had once refused to stop barking. Leah's voice crackled weakly through Reed's chest radio. "Kincaid, Marin and I are 5 minutes below your position. Do not allow removal without itemized inspection and photographic record." Brant heard enough to understand. His smile returned. Council has entered the weather." Delia stepped forward. Tally moved with her, shoulder brushing her knee. "You will not touch a box without my inventory," Delia said. Brant looked almost amused. "Miss Frost, you are not the custodian of this property." "My brother made me executor of his research materials." "Research materials, perhaps, not structural assets." Hector muttered, "There it is, a man dividing ghosts from shelves." One of the contractors had reached the porch with a crate. Tally moved between the crate and the door. She did not lunge, she did not bare her teeth. She simply stood, thin and scarred and immovable, muzzle silver with age, amber eyes fixed on the man's hands. The contractor stopped. "Sir?" Brant's politeness thinned. "The dog is not an officer of the court." "No," Reed said. "She has better instincts." The contractor looked from Tally to Reed and decided wisely to wait. Then everything began happening in pieces. Marin Quaid arrived first, stepping out of the whiteout with snow on her ranger jacket and fury held so tightly it looked like calm. Leah Stroud followed, face pale from cold, black document bag clutched under one arm. Her hair had escaped its neat shape, but her eyes remained mercilessly awake. Leah walked directly to Brant and held out one gloved hand. "Order." Brant passed her a copy. She read quickly. "Temporary removal, pending structural review. It does not waive inventory, chain of custody, or preservation objection from the research executor." "The situation is time-sensitive," Brant said. "So is evidence destruction." "I reject that characterization." "I expected you would." Marin moved toward the men with crates. "Set those down." Brant turned to her. "Ranger Quaid, this is county authority. And this slope drains into federal watershed survey land. Until I verify the root impact, nobody drives loaded material off this ridge. That is an overreach. File a complaint when your tires are warm." For a brief, beautiful second, Hector looked in love. Reed did not have time to enjoy it. Tally had begun pacing, not toward Brant, not toward the contractors. Between Delia and Reed, Reed and Hector, Hector and the radio table. Back to Delia. Her movements were restless but patterned, like she was herding sheep who had forgotten they were a flock. Delia clutched the inventory folder too tightly. Reed could see the idea forming in her face. Sit down in front of the shelves. Make them carry her, too. Hector's eyes were on the transport's engine compartment with an expression suggesting sabotage had begun courting him. Reed himself kept measuring the distance between his fist and Brant's clean mouth. Tally cut across his path. She planted one paw on Reed's boot and looked up. Not now. Reed exhaled through his nose. "Fine," he whispered. She turned immediately and bumped Delia's knee. Delia looked down, then at Reed. Whatever she saw in his face made her step back from the shelves. Hector raised both hands when Tally came for him. "All right, St. Bitey, I am not touching the truck. Yet." The absurdity of it should not have mattered. It did. They stayed together. That gave Leah room to speak, Marin room to block, Delia room to inventory, Hector room to observe, Reed room to think. Nolan, still at the transport, called out, "Rear chain seated wrong. Can't move loaded until I reset." Brant closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the storm had worsened. Inside the cabin, Leah required each proposed box to be identified. Delia read the labels. Hector photographed. Marin witnessed. Brant objected in clean sentences that Leah ignored with professional grace. Reed stood near the radio table, watching the signal meter wobble. It should not have been wobbling. Hector noticed at the same time. He leaned close, all humor gone. "That's not storm fade," he said. "What?" "Pattern's wrong." He moved to the window and looked down toward the transport, then to the lead truck. His eyes narrowed. "Somebody's running a low-power jammer." Reed followed his gaze. A small black case sat under the passenger side of Brant's lead truck, half buried in kicked snow. A thin antenna pointed toward the cabin like a black thorn. "Could be telemetry equipment," Reed said. Hector gave him a look of deep personal disappointment. "And I could be a ballerina." Leah heard them. "Can you document it?" "I can photograph it." "Can you disable it?" Hector smiled without warmth. "Now you're flirting." "Do not destroy it." "You lawyers take the poetry out of everything." Reed looked toward the upper ridge, invisible through the whiteout. The repeater, the missing copies, the public frequency. The truth could not stay in this cabin. Brant's paperwork was built to turn every shelf into a dispute, every dispute into a delay, every delay into a truck driving away after dark. Even if Leah slowed him, even if Marin held the slope, the archive was trapped in a room where the wrong men knew which boxes mattered. They could not win by guarding paper. They had to make the paper speak. Delia saw his face change. "No," she said softly. Reed looked at her. She knew. Before he said it, she knew where his mind had gone. "The ridge is blind white," she said. "It won't get kinder tonight." "It may get you killed." "Yes?" That answer angered her more than any bravado would have. Tally stood between them again, but this time she did not block Reed. She faced the door. Delia reached into a metal case beneath the table and pulled out a small cassette in a cracked plastic sleeve. Her fingers trembled as she held it. Asa's voice log, not the main copy. A field duplicate. She pressed it into Reed's hand. If the repeater cache is intact, this may help align the index. If you hear him... Her throat tightened. Do not listen like a soldier waiting for orders. Reed closed his fingers around the cassette. Delia's eyes shone, but her voice held. Listen like a living man, hearing the dead ask him not to give up. The cabin noise fell away. Brant's objections, Leah's clipped replies, Hector cursing softly near the window, the storm gnawing at the roof. All of it moved to the edge of Reed's awareness. The cassette felt impossibly light. Tally stepped to his side. Reed looked down at her bandaged shoulder. You're not fit for this. The shepherd looked toward the door. It was not argument. It was history. Hector came over with a coil of line, a battery pack, and his burnt-orange cap pulled low. "Take the south spine, not the old service climb. Wind scours it cleaner. If you fall, try not to break the expensive parts." "What are the expensive parts?" Hector shoved the battery pack into his hands. "At your age? Sentiment." Marin stepped into Reed's path outside the cabin door. "I cannot authorize this." "Good. I can mark that you acted outside instruction." "Even better." Her eyes searched his face. Whatever she found there did not comfort her. "Come back, Kincaid. I have not finished being angry with you." Leah, from behind her, said, "If you transmit anything, identify time, source, and location. Do not editorialize." Hector barked a laugh. "Man's walking into a whiteout and she's worried about formatting." Leah looked at him. "Formatting survives court." Reed almost smiled. Almost. He clipped the radio strap tight, secured the cassette inside his inner pocket, and stepped into the storm. Tally came with him. At the porch edge, Reed looked back once. Delia stood in the doorway with Ace's blanket around her shoulders, one hand pressed to the doorframe. Behind her, Leah and Marin faced Brant Voss with paper, law, and an anger disciplined enough to matter. Hector crouched near the window, photographing the black jammer case while pretending not to be freezing. Nolan Price stood by the transport, taking far too long with a tire chain no longer tangled. Brant watched Reed leave. For the first time, the polished man did not look amused. Reed turned toward the upper ridge. The whiteout swallowed the first 10 yards of trail. Tally moved ahead, slow but certain, her scarred shoulder cutting a dark line through the snow. Reed followed with Ace's voice against his chest and the whole cabin holding its breath behind him. The ridge did not rise like a road. It rose like a refusal. Reed Kincaid followed Tally into the whiteout with the cassette pressed against his chest and the battery pack pulling hard at his shoulder. Behind him, Frost 12 disappeared in less than 20 steps. The cabin, the trucks, the arguments, the clean voice of Brant Voss, the clipped questions from Leah, Hector's curses, Delia's pale face in the doorway, all of it became a rumor behind the snow. Ahead, there was only white, not darkness. Darkness would have been kinder. Darkness gave a man edges. This was a bright blindness, a world without distance, where the ground vanished into the sky and every tree appeared only after it had already become a danger. Tally moved ahead of him, slow and deliberate. Her injured shoulder dragged a fraction lower than the other, but she did not weave. She used the wind-carved ribs of snow along the south spine, just as Hector had said. Each time Reed tried to push past the pace she set, she stopped, turned, and fixed him with an amber stare so stern it would have embarrassed a commanding officer. "I know," Reed muttered after the third time. Tally did not move. "I said I know." She still did not move. Reed leaned on one knee, breathing hard through his teeth. Pain flashed up his bad leg in white, hot pulses that had nothing to do with the weather. His pride wanted speed. His body wanted honesty. Tally, apparently, had chosen honesty. "Fine," he said. 30 seconds. Only then did she turn back toward the ridge. The storm made strange music around them. Snow whispered across Reed's parka. Ice clicked in the branches. Somewhere below, a truck engine started and stopped, swallowed by distance. The radio at his chest hissed with useless fragments. He checked the compass taped to his wrist strap. South spine, upper rise, rock notch, repeater shack, simple on paper. Paper had never felt wind. Halfway up, Reed slipped on a crusted slab and went down hard on one hand. The battery pack slammed into his ribs. He lay still for a moment, cheek against snow, listening to his own breath scrape in and out. Tally came back. She did not bark. She pressed her cold nose against his ear. "Don't," Reed said. "I'm getting up." The dog waited as if she had heard better speeches from worse men. He pushed himself to one knee. His glove had torn at the palm, and a bead of blood darkened the snow before freezing at the edge. He flexed his fingers. Nothing broken. The radio crackled, not the dead pulse from the repeater, not Hector, not Leah. A woman's voice burst through the static, bright, elderly, and annoyed. "Whoever is breathing like a bull elk into Channel 12, identify yourself before I start insulting you by name." Reed froze. Tally's ears lifted. The voice returned. "I heard that silence. That is either equipment failure or male stubbornness. Both are treatable." Reed grabbed the mic. "This is Reed Kincaid moving toward Upper Ridge Repeater from Frost 12. A pause. Then the woman said, "Kincaid. Well, saints preserve the wiring. I thought you'd become a ghost with a toolbox." "Who is this?" "Iris Bellamy, retired Coastal Rescue Dispatch, still owner of the best radio kitchen in Mason County, and currently the only woman foolish enough to monitor Asa Frost's antique frequencies during a whiteout." Reed closed his eyes once. He knew the name. Everyone in the old rescue network had known Iris Bellamy, even if they had never seen her. She had been a voice over storm channels for years, warm, precise, and capable of making terrified fishermen obey instructions by sounding disappointed in them. "Iris," he said, "You need to stop standing in open wind while explaining things. Move 10 yards upslope. There should be a rock shoulder on your left. The ridge blocks Northline's little toy jammer there." Reed looked ahead. Nothing but white. "I don't see it." "Then trust the dog, not your eyes. Eyes are dramatic in snow." Tally had already turned left. Reed followed. 10 yards later, the wind dropped suddenly. A dark wall of rock appeared beside him, close enough to touch. Iris came through clearer. "There. Now tell me what Asa's Disaster Museum has gotten itself into." Reed gave her the short version while moving. "Northline convoy, emergency removal order, missing tapes, cut antenna, suspected jammer, repeater pulse." Iris said nothing until he finished. When she answered, all humor had left her voice. "Asa kept upper cache logs because he trusted mountains more than boards of commissioners." "Can we wake the repeater?" "Maybe. If the battery bank isn't cracked, if the panel hasn't iced over, if the relay board still remembers it was born for service, and if you listen when I speak." Reed climbed over a fallen limb. "I listen." "No, Kincaid, you endure sound, different religion." The words struck clean. He almost snapped back. Then Tally stopped again, looking over her shoulder with that same merciless patience. Reed swallowed the answer. "All right," he said. "I'll listen." For the first time since the climb began, Iris did not reply immediately. Then, softer, "Good." Asa would have liked hearing that. The repeater shack appeared as a gray box half buried in snow near the top of the ridge, crouched beneath a skeletal metal tower. Ice had armored the door. The small solar panel mounted on the frame was coated in frozen white. The antenna line sagged, but had not snapped. Reed reached the door and leaned one forearm against it, breathing hard. Tally came beside him, sides heaving, shoulder bandage damp and dark at the edge. "You should have stayed," Reed told her. Tally put one paw against the door. "Of course." Reed took out the pry tool. The ice broke in stubborn plates. Twice his hand slipped. Once pain shot through his knee so sharply he had to press his forehead to the frozen door and wait for the world to steady. Iris kept talking through the radio, not with sympathy, but with instructions. "Panel first, clear the panel, then access box. Do not force the lower hinge unless you want to spend the evening holding the door like a flag in a hurricane." "Yes, ma'am." Oh, now he finds manners. Historic day. Reed cleared the solar panel with his sleeve, then chipped ice from the access box. Inside, the equipment looked older than hope and twice as tired. A charge controller blinked once every few seconds. The backup battery meter sat just above dead. A relay board rested behind a metal cover with Ace's handwriting on a strip of tape. If dead, reset manually. If you are lazy, become less so. Despite the cold, Reed felt the corner of his mouth shift. Your friend had opinions, he said. Asa had opinions about toast, Iris replied. Get the cover off. Reed worked by touch and flashlight. The screws resisted. The cold made every small task feel like surgery performed in a river. Tally stood pressed against his leg, not for warmth alone. When he swayed, she leaned. When he cursed, she blinked. When he tried to rush, she shifted just enough to interrupt his balance, not stopping him, keeping him. At last the board was exposed. Iris, he said, I've got a red indicator on relay 3, frost on the lower contact. Do not scrape it with your knife. I wasn't. You were thinking it. Men think loudly. He breathed out through his nose. What do I use? Warm the housing with your hand first. Slowly. Then cloth. Then reseat the toggle. If you crack that board, I will climb up there after retirement and haunt you in person. Reed pulled off his torn glove and pressed his bare fingers around the housing. Cold bit instantly. He held on. The mountain narrowed to one small act. Warm metal. Do not break it. Listen. His fingers began to ache, then burn, then go numb. He thought of the cabin below, Delia's hand on Tally's back, Leah speaking law into a storm, Marin holding a boundary no one could see, Hector pretending jokes were enough armor, Nolan Price delaying a convoy, one tire chain at a time. For years, Reed had believed responsibility was a door that closed behind you. Step through alone, do the job, pay the cost. But this did not feel like a door. It felt like a net. And for once, he was not the only strand. The frost loosened. He wiped the contact clean, reseated the toggle, and connected Hector's battery pack to the auxiliary leads. The board clicked. The repeater gave a low hum. Tally lifted her head. Iris whispered over the radio. There she is. Down in the White Valley, something answered. A faint carrier tone. Then another. The old network waking reluctantly, like an elder clearing his throat in a room where the young had been talking too loudly. Reed took out the cassette. His hands paused over it. The tape was light, too light for what it carried. Delia's words returned to him, not like a soldier waiting for orders, like a living man hearing the dead ask him not to give up. Can we patch audio? He asked. We can, Iris said, but first you speak. No, Asa's recording first. No, Iris said, and her voice became all command. The valley needs to know who is standing there now. Ghosts can testify after the living identify the room. Reed stared at the microphone. He had spoken in briefings, into tactical comms, into storm channels when there was a task to name and no part of himself required. But this was different. This was not just information. This was his voice leaving the mountain, passing through kitchens, garages, ferry offices, old radios above stoves, reaching people who might remember him, judge him, pity him, ignore him. The old fear rose, not of death, of being heard and found insufficient. Tally pressed against his knee. Then, slowly, she lifted her head and placed her scarred neck beneath his bare hand. Reed went still. That place, the collar-worn place she had guarded from him, from everyone, rested against his palm, warm beneath the cold fur, fragile and offered. No thunder broke, no music swelled. The world did not forgive anyone. A wounded dog simply trusted him with the part of herself that had hurt most. Reed closed his fingers gently. All right, he whispered. He keyed the mic. This is Reed Kincaid transmitting from Upper Ridge Repeater above Frost 12 Weather Archive. Time approximately 1640. Emergency preservation traffic. Northline timber contractors are attempting removal of selected archive materials from Frost 12 under disputed county order. Materials include flow records, flood logs, ferry rescue audio, tributary field books, and maintenance requests connected to the North Spur watershed. His voice shook once. He kept going. Any station receiving on Legacy Weather Network, record this transmission if able. Relay to County Emergency Management, District Ranger Maren Quaid, Attorney Leah Stroud, and any civil authority with jurisdiction over water, road access, or evidence preservation. Static answered. Then Iris said quietly, "Good. Now let Asa speak." Reed fed the cassette into the small field player Hector had packed and patched the audio through the repeater input. For a moment, there was only hiss. Then a man's voice entered the storm. Asa Frost sounded younger than Reed expected, rough-edged, amused, and tired in the way of people who had learned to keep working past discouragement. Frost 12 Field Log, Upper Tributary Warning Series, Copy 3. If this one gets played, somebody ignored the first two, which means I am either right or very irritating. Possibly both. Iris made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. The recording continued. Asa described feeder streams above the proposed North Spur Route, snowpack melt timing, culvert strain, old flood marks, ferry disruptions caused by sudden sediment surges, names of people warned in past seasons, dates of radio calls, Northline consultant visits, requests for maintenance review. A final note, voice lower now. If these records leave the mountain before review, the water won't forget. It will simply become someone else's surprise. The tape clicked on, then stopped. For half a minute, no one spoke. Reed thought the transmission had failed. Then the radio cracked open. "This is Bellamy Home Station recording." Another voice followed, male, older. "Hoodsport Marina office receiving. Recording. I remember the January ferry call. Asa got us moving before the tower died." A woman's voice came next. "Lena Ortiz, Bay Road Diner. We've got the old kitchen radio on. Recording on my phone. My brother's place flooded in the thaw year. Those logs matter." Another. "County Road Crew West Shed. Receiving Legacy Weather. We've got a copy running." Then Hector's voice from below, distorted but delighted. "Frost 12 cabin receiving. Also, Brant Voss looks like he swallowed a porcupine." Reed bowed his head. It was not laughter that rose in him. Not quite. It was something more dangerous. Relief. The valley had heard. At Frost 12, the consequences arrived fast. Through broken transmissions, Reed caught pieces. Leah demanding all removal. Stop pending preservation review. Maren identifying the watershed issue over open channel. Delia reading item labels into the record. Hector photographing the jammer. Nolan refusing to load under disputed chain of custody. Brant objecting, then lowering his voice when he realized the lowered voice no longer controlled the room. The archive was no longer a cabin in a storm. It was a public signal. Reed stayed beside the repeater until Iris confirmed multiple recordings. His fingers throbbed with returning pain. His knee pulsed. Tally leaned against his leg, exhausted now, the cost of the climb showing in the tremor through her shoulders. "You did it," Iris said over the radio. Reed looked down at the dog. "No," he said. "We got heard." Iris was quiet for a moment. Then she answered, "Same miracle, different wiring." Below the ridge, lights began to appear through the weather. Not many, just a few at first. Headlamps on the lower road, a vehicle beacon, then another. People moving toward the mountain not as a mob, not as heroes, but as witnesses carrying what they could: radios, phones, notebooks, memory. Reed watched the faint lights gather under the white sky. For years he had thought silence was shelter. Now, standing beside an old repeater with Asa's dead voice still humming in the wires and Tally's scarred neck warm beneath his hand, Reed understood what silence had really been. A room with no windows. He keyed the mic one last time. Upper Ridge to Frost 12. Kincaid and Tally beginning descent when safe. Delia's voice answered, thin with static and feeling. Frost 12 receiving. A pause, then softer. Bring her back. Reed looked at Tally. The old shepherd looked toward the hidden cabin below, then back at him. Yeah, he said. He secured the equipment, tucked Asa's cassette inside his parka, and turned from the repeater into the bright, bitter snow. This time, when Tally led, Reed did not think of following as surrender. He thought of it as being guided home. The truth did not come down the mountain like thunder. It came down slowly, wrapped in wet paper, radio recordings, sworn statements, battery logs, road photographs, and the tired voices of people who had not slept enough to lie elegantly. That disappointed some folks in the valley. They had heard Reed Kincaid's voice over the old weather channel. They had heard Asa Frost's recording crackle through the whiteout like a dead man leaning close to the living. They had seen Northline's convoy halted beneath Frost 12 while snow buried the tire tracks around it. A few had expected Justice to arrive by nightfall with flashing lights and a man in handcuffs. Justice, as Leah Stroud explained later, was rarely that theatrical unless it had already failed somewhere else. By morning, the convoy was gone, but the archive remained. A county preservation hold had been filed before midnight. Marin Quaid documented the blocked culvert and the altered hazard sign with the grim satisfaction of a woman who preferred evidence to outrage. Hector Wynn photographed the radio jammer in place, then complained for 10 minutes because Leah would not let him take it apart, just to admire the wicked little guts of it. Nolan Price gave a statement in the county office 2 days later. He wore the same faded trucker cap, turned it in both hands, and admitted he had been instructed to prioritize certain boxes over others. Not all archive materials, certain boxes. When Leah asked who had given those instructions, Nolan stared at the table for so long that the room seemed to lean toward him. Brant Voss, he said at last. His voice did not sound heroic. It sounded like a man setting down a weight that had been hurting his back for years. Iris Bellamy sent in recordings from her kitchen radio, along with a handwritten note that said, in careful blue ink, "If anyone tries to claim the signal was unclear, please tell them I am old, not deaf." Hector said the note should be framed. Leah said it would be entered as supporting documentation. Hector said lawyers had a gift for taking the fun out of holy relics. Brant Voss did not collapse. Men like Brant rarely did. They adjusted. At first, Northline Timber called the entire matter a misunderstanding caused by deteriorating weather, aging infrastructure, and heightened emotions around a historic property. Brant described the removal order as a good faith effort to preserve vulnerable materials. He expressed concern for Delia Frost's well-being. He praised emergency personnel. He used the word community 3 times in one statement and responsibility 4. Then the emails began surfacing. Not one grand confession, nothing so clean, just fragments. A consultant memo warning that Asa Frost's flow records could delay the North Spur proposal. A message asking whether the archive could be temporarily relocated before evidentiary review. A dispatch note describing the culvert issue as useful for access restriction. A list of archive boxes matching the very materials Brant's convoy had tried to remove. The worst sins, Reed thought, often wore the plainest shoes. No one could prove Brant wanted a flood. That was not the shape of what he had done. He had not stood on a ridge and wished harm down into the valley. He had done something colder and more ordinary. He had decided the warning could wait. He had decided the people who depended on that warning were small enough to be managed. Northline placed him on leave. Then Brant resigned. There was no cheering when the news reached the valley. The people who had trusted him did not know where to put their embarrassment. The people who had doubted him did not know where to put their anger. Cedar and fir do not clap when a rotten branch breaks. They simply stand in the weather afterward, feeling the new gap. Frost 12 was sealed first. A yellow notice appeared on the door. No unauthorized removal, no disturbance of materials. Pending review. Delia stood before that notice for a long time the day it was posted. She wore Asa's red-gray blanket around her shoulders, though the day was not as cold as the storm had been. Tally sat beside her, one ear high, one bent, the silver around her muzzle catching the pale sun. "It looks official," Delia said. Leah, standing beside her with a black document bag under one arm, said, "That is because it is official." "I meant ugly." "That too." Delia almost smiled. For weeks the cabin existed in a strange half-life, protected but not yet reborn, safe but not yet useful. Leah filed motions, requests, objections, and proposals. Marin pushed for watershed review. Hector repaired what officials allowed him to repair, then repaired 3 other things when no one was looking, and argued that loose screws were not legal entities. Reed returned to his cabin at the lower foothill, but it did not feel the same. His firewood still stood in even rows. The soup cans remained counted. The old radio sat on the table where it always had. His boots dried by the stove. The axe leaned beside the wood rack. Everything was in place. That was the problem. The place felt arranged for a man who had mistaken order for peace. 2 mornings after the storm, Hector arrived without knocking, carrying a dented thermos and a carburetor Reed recognized from a snowmobile that had not run since the previous winter. "Thing's dead," Hector said. Reed looked at it. "You brought me a carburetor with no engine." "Don't rush art." "What do you want?" "Coffee." "You have a thermos?" "It's terrible. I made it myself." Reed stared at him. Hector stared back. Tally, lying on the rug near the stove, lifted her head and thumped her tail once. Reed opened the door wider. That was how the fortress began to fail. Not with a speech, with a bad thermos. Marin came by the next week and left a spare Ranger radio on his table. "I don't need that," Reed said. "I know." "Then why leave it?" "Because need is not the only useful category." She walked out before he could argue. Reed watched her truck leave, the radio sitting on the table like a small, stubborn animal. Iris called the old channel every few nights. Sometimes she had information. Usually she had opinions. "Kincaid, your signal drifts low after sundown." "It's the ridge." "It is your antenna angle." "It's the ridge." I survived 42 years of fishermen blaming weather for operator error. Do not bring me nostalgia. Tally would lie beneath the table during these calls, eyes half closed, as if Iris's voice belonged to the house now. Delia sent Reed a photograph in an envelope with no note at first. It showed Asa Frost years earlier, standing in front of Frost 12 in a green field jacket, laughing at something outside the frame. Beside him stood a younger Tally, fuller in the chest, coat bright black and gold, eyes fierce, ears both almost straight then. One of Asa's hands rested lightly between her shoulders. Not ownership, partnership. On the back, Delia had written, "He always said she knew when people were pretending not to hear." Reed looked at the photo for a long time. Tally came to his knee and sniffed it. Her tail did not move. Her body did not tremble. She simply lowered herself beside him, pressing one scarred shoulder against his boot. Not grief, not peace either. Something between them, where the living keep the dead warm enough to carry. By late winter, the valley had begun building something without waiting to be told it was allowed. A retired ferry mechanic donated 2 old radio receivers. Lena Ortiz from the Bay Road Diner brought a coffee urn, 3 folding chairs, and a handwritten sign that said, "Weather first, gossip second." A road crew worker brought laminated maps. Someone's uncle delivered a stack of notebooks from a closed marine supply shop. Iris mailed labels for frequency channels because, as she wrote, if men are left alone with tape, civilization collapses. There was no wealthy sponsor, no giant check, no ceremony with matching jackets, only people arriving one by one with useful things. And stories. That mattered most to Delia. She stopped guarding Asa's work like a widow of the archive and began adding to it. She recorded interviews at kitchen tables and ferry docks. She asked old road workers about flood years. She listened to marina owners describe fog by smell. She wrote down which creek turned gray before sliding and which bend in the road froze even when the rest thawed clean. "I thought I was preserving his memory," she told Reed one afternoon while they sorted maps beneath the repaired cabin window. But memory that never gets used becomes another locked room. Reed adjusted a radio bracket. "Asa say that?" "No." "Good. He was getting too many good lines." Delia looked at him, then laughed. It surprised them both. Tally, lying between 2 boxes of newly labeled field notebooks, opened one eye with weary approval. Spring came slowly, as if winter had to be persuaded down from the higher ridges. Snow withdrew from the service road in ragged strips. Water began to speak under ice. The blocked culvert was cleared, replaced, photographed, inspected, and then inspected again because Marin stood nearby with her yellow field notebook and a face that made men explain themselves fully. Northline's North Spur proposal was not destroyed. It was altered. That mattered. The route was shifted away from the sensitive feeder streams. Additional water monitoring was required. A public review period was added. The company hated every inch of it and called the changes burdensome. Leah called them a beginning. Hector called them the least a guilty machine can do before breakfast. Brant Voss vanished from public meetings after his resignation. Once Reed saw him from a distance outside the county building, standing beside a clean truck in a dark coat, speaking to no one. Brant looked smaller, without a room arranged to obey him. Reed felt no triumph, only a sober kind of recognition. Some men did not become villains because they loved harm. They became dangerous because they loved control more than consequence. By the time the maples began showing red buds along the lower road, Frost 12 had a new name painted on a cedar board above the door. ASA Frost Community Weather Cabin. The paint was imperfect. Hector blamed the brush. Delia blamed Hector. Hector claimed the brush had a poor work ethic. There was no grand opening because Delia refused the phrase. "It is not a grocery store," she said. So they had coffee. That was all. Coffee, repaired radios, maps on the wall, new notebooks waiting on the table, the old base unit humming with less static than before, and Tally lying in the center of the room as if she had been placed there by some ancient order of winter priests. People came in with snowmelt on their boots and stories in their pockets. A fairy hand pointed at an old rescue log and said his father's name was there. A road worker added a note about rockfall after warm rain. Lena Ortiz taped the diner's number beside the channel list because half the valley called her before they called anyone official anyway. Reed stayed near the edge of the room at first. Old habits did not die because a sign changed. Delia found him by the radio table. "We need a morning voice." "No, I have not asked yet." "You were about to." "You are irritatingly observant when avoiding service." "I am not a radio host." "No one asked for a host, just readings, temperature, wind, snowpack, creek reports." "My voice is rough." Delia glanced toward the room where Hector was explaining to Marin that coffee tasted better when poured by someone not employed by the government. "Voices too smooth hide things." Reed looked at her. She held his gaze, not pleading. Offering. "No," he said. Tally stood. That ended the debate more effectively than Delia ever could have. The old shepherd walked to the microphone stand, turned once in a stiff circle, sat down beside it, and looked at Reed. Hector nearly spilled his coffee. "Well," he said. "Motion carried." Marin nodded. "Unanimous." Iris's voice came through the speaker from her home station. "Put the man on before the dog loses respect for democracy." Reed stared at the room. No one clapped. No one made a speech. No one looked at him like a statue being unveiled. They looked at him as if they expected him to do a small, useful thing, because small, useful things were how people survived. That was harder and better. He stepped to the microphone. His hand hovered over the switch. Tally leaned gently against his boot. The old scar along her shoulder had healed over in a pale seam. Her muzzle was still silver as sea salt. Her eyes were tired, watchful, alive. Reed pressed the switch. "This is Reed Kincaid at Asa Frost Community Weather Cabin," he said. The room stilled. He read the morning numbers. Temperature, wind out of the west, overnight snowmelt, creek height at the lower gauge, road surface conditions near the north bend. Nothing grand, nothing polished. Just facts, carried carefully. Then he paused. Outside the window, sunlight touched the last snow on the fir branches. Water ran from the eaves in clear drops. Down the valley, radios in kitchens, garages, ferry offices, and ranger trucks waited with their small red lights glowing. Reed leaned closer to the mic. "If anyone on the North Branch hears water turning gray or stones moving under the creek, call it in. If your old radio catches something strange, don't talk yourself out of reporting it. Someone is listening." He released the switch. No applause came. The radio answered instead. Iris first. "Bellamy Home Station receiving. Signal adequate. Voice needs work. Sentiment acceptable." Hector whispered, "High praise." Then another voice. Lena from the diner. "Bay Road receiving. A man from the road crew. West Shed receiving. Marin's Ranger Unit. District receiving." One by one, the valley replied. Not loudly, not dramatically, like lamps being lit in windows after dusk. Reed looked down at Tally. She rested her head against his leg, eyes half closed. For years he had thought belonging meant entering a room without pain, without memory, without the old failures walking beside him. He had been wrong. Belonging was being allowed to bring those things in and still be handed a job. Delia stood near the map wall, Asa's old notebook in her hands. Her face was not free of grief. It never would be. But grief had changed shape there. It had stopped being a locked room and become a doorway people could pass through carefully. Outside, the Olympic foothills shone under a pale spring sun. Snow still waited in the high places. It always would. Winter never truly left that country. It only learned when to answer softly. Reed reached down and rested his hand on Tally's neck. She did not flinch. Below the mountain, old radios kept glowing, and his voice, rough and imperfect, went out across the valley, not as the echo of a man hiding from the world, but as a small light set in a window for anyone watching the water rise. Sometimes peace does not arrive as silence. Sometimes it comes as a weak signal through the storm, an old dog refusing to give up, or one honest voice brave enough to say, "Someone is listening." Reed learned that healing is not forgetting the people we have lost. It is carrying what they loved into the world, so their light can still guide someone home. And maybe grace is like that too. Not always loud, not always dramatic, but faithful enough to reach us through the snow. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us who or what has helped you keep listening when life became hard. And if you'd like more stories of loyalty, courage, and quiet miracles, Please subscribe and join us for the next one. May peace find you tonight, even in the places where winter still feels heavy.